Sharona Hoffman from Case Western Reserve University School of Law. So I think you yourself have written that it's very difficult to determine what genetic information actually is, especially as we discover that more and more conditions are associated with genetic abnormalities. So what complications would that introduce? And is GINA even meaningful if everything is genetic information?
Okay, so you asked a great question, and I have consistently over many years said that I thought as a matter of policy it's a bad idea to treat genetic information differently from other health information. So the whole notion of genetic exceptionalism I reject, because there's a genetic component in virtually all diseases, and drawing those distinctions may be a self-fulfilling prophecy, increasing the stigma attached, and blah, 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 blah. I haven't changed my view about that, but this research project is sort of a recognition of the realities of the world. Congress saw fit in 2008, after 13 years of careful deliberation, to enact a law that treats genetic information differently from other health information. And we can't even abide by that, given the state of our existing HIT structure. So I said, okay, let's take that as a given, use the definitions that Congress did to the extent that we can in the statute, and let's see if we can identify that information and sequester it. You raise a great question of, I mean, whether it's a bad idea to even have to try to do this, whether we should have gone a different route to protect people from health-based discrimination or predictive health-based discrimination or whatever you want to call it. But the advantage of starting here is that it's I think, the easiest case for a variety of reasons. And if we can demonstrate the sort of the proof of concept that you could do this, then it's going to be applied elsewhere in other domains where I think it's important as well. So
what exactly would you tell them to take out? Family history and DNA? What exactly would you tell them to take out? Family history and DNA tests or anything else?
Correct. The statute has this three-part definition, and family health history is in the statute and in the regs defined to include 4 generations. And we would screen those items out. We would, you know, have the results of DNA-based tests as defined in the statutes and the regs. Now, I mean, I agree that that may not be the way we want to slice the world, but that's the way the world has been sliced for us. And I want to take this and see if I can, at least in this context, make it work.
This is Maya Bernstein from HHS. Mark, there are examples in the law already of other specially sensitive information that the law has already recognized that should be segregated in some way. So I'm thinking of Part 2 information. Part 2 is what at HHS, it's substance abuse and mental health treatment records. HIPAA has a special section for psychotherapy notes. It says you don't have to segregate it, but if you want to not disclose psychotherapy notes to the patient, you're going to have to segregate them. We have a new provision in the Recovery Act that says, somebody mentioned it earlier, that if you pay cash for a particular service, then you can direct your provider not to give that information to your plan, and they have to do that. And you know, the VA still has rules that say sickle cell information, HIV information, and states have similar kind of provisions that say you have to do something special with this data, it has to be segregated. So what are those people doing if we're having trouble proving that it can be done? They must be doing something, right, with those kinds of data.
Well, I think they are doing something, but the something is not always, in my judgment, good enough. And so let's take the issue of mental health information, leaving aside the psychotherapy notes exception, okay? It would be, I think, rather easy to tag the records based on provider, So if you had a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist, you could flag those and treat them separately. You could have a whole series of diagnostic codes. You could have a whole series of prescription codes and treat that information separately. The problem is that, particularly in mental health, it turns out that most mental health services are provided by primary care physicians, not specialists, and increasingly so today because third-party payers don't want to pay for therapy. They want to pay for drugs, and you get the drugs from your primary care doc as well as a psychiatrist. And it's impossible to capture at the moment a lot of the free text and a lot of the non-coded stuff in health records. That would be another case down the road if we could prove that this method would work. So the two different tracks in which you would have to go on are, number one, type of health information. So you might do substance abuse, so you might do mental health and so forth. And then you're going to have to maybe go down a separate track in terms of the nature of the disclosure. And this gets into the issue that you talked about earlier, that we raised in an earlier letter, in fact in 2006, on contextual access criteria. So here's how this would work. Here's the sort of a much more complicated application. How can we segregate or segment information in health records so that when someone applies for a job, the employer gets only the information in the health record that's relevant to the job? Well, there are maybe 100,000 different job titles. What are you going to do? Well, you might be able to condense them into much smaller number of fields based on what their physical demands are. And then you have to translate the physical demands into the health information that would bear on the physical demands. And then you have to, at that point, develop the computer applications to identify where in the health record those health matters are that bear on the physical demands. I mean, it's sort of a multi-step process, and you can see how difficult that would be. And I actually contemplated doing research in this area maybe 10 years ago, and I tried to enlist the human resources people and the occupational physicians, and they gave me a variety of very unusual looks. And so I thought, genetics, let's go with that. So, but eventually, I think if we believe in this stuff, we're going to have to get there.
Marcus, I think oh, I'm sorry, Andy Podgurski, Case Western Reserve University, Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. I think the way you phrased that last point indicates that you realize that how difficult it would be technically to distinguish that kind of information. And as a computer scientist, my own impression is that would be nearly as impossible. But conceivably, there are other ways to approach it which might involve massive changes to existing law. For instance, having a physician certify you as suitable for certain kinds of activities, where instead of having to disclose willy-nilly what's in your electronic health record to your potential employer, some trusted party could, make the determination on your behalf.
I think that's a great suggestion. The problem is that employers are not that crazy about it. The large employers that have full-time occupational medical departments, they actually do that. I mean, that's essentially what they do. The docs get the records, and they make a determination because they're familiar with the working conditions and the job titles and responsibilities, and they say that, applicant number 314 is, fit to do the job, and we'll go ahead with them. The problem is that most employers don't have full-time occupational physicians, and to the extent that they use them, they're contract docs, and they may do 20 different industries, and any particular employer would have to have the confidence in this doc? And then who has the right to select the doc? Is it the employer? Does the applicant get to pick the doc? I mean, if we were to start over and design the sort of pre-placement medical system, I think your suggestion is terrific. And I think that's the way it ought to go, because only the doc would have a sort of an up or down call, or maybe you can hire this person with certain restrictions, and here are the restrictions. There's a weight lifting limitation, or can't climb heights or whatever. That would be fine. But whenever you try to get into this area, the employers are extremely resistant. When the ADA was enacted in 1990, there was a great deal of controversy on this second provision. Remember I said at the pre-employment stage you can't do anything, at the current employee stage it has to be job-related or voluntary, these examinations. Well, what should the middle area be? And why do employers insist that they want to be free to do anything they want? And their argument is, well, we never know what we're going to find, and blah, blah, blah. And so that's why Section 102D3 of the ADA reads the way it does. There were many people who were advocating that the last two sections ought to be the same. So for conditional offerees and employees, it ought to all be job-related. 2 states have adopted that, Minnesota and California, but the other 48 states have not and haven't expressed any interest in doing that.
A question, Doug Hasbrook, MD here in Utah. The first is very simple. On your slide where you had the numbers of data requests and the 25 million number or something like that, was that assumed in a year? Is that annualized for the country or what?
Yes, that's annual for the country, and I can give you the reference where it has all the methodology of how we came to those figures. Each one had to be separately calculated.
Okay. I mean, I assumed it was annualized. I didn't know if it was just for your institution or what the scope was. So that's, I mean, it's a big number, which I don't think a lot of people would be aware of. And my second is comes back to the discussion you were just having. It seems that I think you doing this study would be very important, because I think just revealing the inadequacy in the current systems and the scope, like the 25 million would be revealing. And I do think it speaks to something like minimum data sets, because even on this employment thing in the instance you're talking about, you could say that something wide open is clearly not able to be administered, and so agreeing on what is a minimum data set that could satisfy the need while still being feasible and protecting certain areas of privacy. So I wondered if you'd thought about what your reaction to minimum data sets as perhaps being having a role here.
I'd have to think about it. I mean, in terms of the employment setting, I think the easiest thing to do would be to start by broad job categories. There are millions of workers, the office workers and the supermarket clerks and so forth, where there's no reason to have this exhaustive review. It's not cost effective, and most companies don't do it anyhow, but they want to reserve the right to do that. I mean, if you could just sort of lop them off and now say, all right, we're talking about coal miners, and we're talking about construction workers and all sorts of other physically demanding work. What's the most effective way to do that? Is it Andy's suggestion where you have a knowledgeable physician who makes the call sort of up or down based on their records, and presumably they're going to be bound to keep those confidential and so forth? Is it releasing of a minimum data set? I mean, I think there are lots of different possibilities that I would love to see people funded to do research on, but I don't see that happening until there's the sort of the legal impetus. That's one of the beauties of GINA. It now has the legal impetus to demand that we actually try to figure out how we tailor the disclosures to what the law says they ought to be.
Mark Williams, Intermountain Healthcare. I wanted to drill down on the informed consent aspects of your study and reflect that back to where we started this morning, the first couple of presentations, where we were talking about potentially developing consent matrices that would allow patients to have a variety of different options about what they would allow and what they would not allow, and kind of customize that to some degree. At the center of that is sort of an assumption that consent actually has some meaning to us, and I suspect that the reason that you included that in your project as a sub-aim relates to the fact that you maybe think that we don't understand consent perhaps as well as we should, and particularly with all the aspects of you know, whether somebody's compelled to consent or has the sense that they're being compelled to consent, or do they really understand what they're consenting to, et cetera. Does the concept of consent in this space have meaning at the present time? And if so, how can we take advantage of that?
It's a great question. I'm not sure I have an answer that will do justice to the question. I think we've made major mistakes in the way we've developed consent in practice. In theory, the notion of consent is a good one, but we haven't really paid the price to make consent work. And we've never really paid the price under the HIPAA privacy rule to make even notice work, because everyone will concede that the notice and request for acknowledgement is a joke. So the question is, does it make sense to stay with consent? And I think that my view is yes, we need to make consent work. And the reason we have this sub-study in there is a reaction to the IOM report last fall. And if you haven't read that, the IOM studied the HIPAA privacy rule and the common rule and recommended that informed consent be abolished for any kind of research that doesn't involve any clinical intervention. So in other words, information-based research only does not require informed consent. And if you think about the harms caused in the research process, many of those harms could accrue to individuals regardless of whether there is a clinical intervention or not. And so what I would hope to be able to demonstrate is that even for de-identified research, it's not unduly burdensome on the enterprise to obtain consent. So that's why we're timing how long it takes and who does it and what the costs are based on the pay of the individuals. The various demographic factors, why they object, and what the percentages of the objection, et cetera. So I would hope to be able to demonstrate in that part of the study that, yes, it is feasible to obtain informed consent even for de-identified research, and if that's true, certainly prospectively for information-based research that's identifiable. Now, I'll leave aside the issue of what you do with data that's already been collected. So that was the purpose of that, and it's an attempt to make informed consent meaningful and workable. If you look at any of the studies where you interview 1,000 people and ask them if they're concerned about privacy and blah, 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 do they want to know if researchers are going to access their stuff? Overwhelmingly, they say, we want to have a say in this. They also say overwhelmingly that if you ask us, we'll let you have the stuff. So you got to build on that. Okay, we'll ask you, we want it, but we don't want to be burdened in the process of asking you, and we don't want to have the research made unusable by any sort of bias that might accrue from who's in and who's out. And the research on that particular point doesn't exist. I mean, I've read the studies, and they don't really support that. You've got a lot of survey research of researchers who ask them, would it be burdensome to you if you had to do this? I mean, it's like asking a sixth grader, if you didn't have homework tomorrow, would you be a better student? And so what astonishes me is that in the research enterprise, I mean, that's what we're talking about here, there's very little research that's done on how to make it work. And not to get on a soapbox, I believe, and I'm a researcher too, I have to get some of the same consents that you do. I think that researchers need to exhibit the same careful analysis, thoughtfulness, innovativeness, etc., in dealing with their human subjects as they do in designing their studies and analyzing their data. No researcher would say, oh, looks like we've got an association here. They're going to analyze and reanalyze and have people. But the front end, getting the human subjects involved, and we all take responsibility for this, is now sort of a checkbox. All right, we got to do this before we get through the IRB. We got to do this before NIH will fund us or whatever. And I think we're paying the price.
Leslie Francis, University of Utah. And if there aren't other questions for Mark specifically, after I ask this one, I wasn't sure about hands. I want to also remind people to feel free to ask other presenters questions before we close this session. Pass it around so the floor is open for discussion not only of this session, but of earlier sessions if there were questions that you had or topics you want to press. So, Mark, there's another federal statute that you didn't mention that wasn't even in your list of disclosures. And I want to know why and whether you think it makes a difference. That statute is the Family Medical Leave Act. And that's another statute under which people might be required to disclose medical records. Although in that case, the medical records that are likely to be disclosed would be medical records about family members. So implicitly, potentially within GINA. So I want to ask you to reflect on the question of even your slide about disclosures didn't include FMLA disclosures, and I'm curious about why.
Because we could get good data on that. There's no place where those are compiled. Workers' comp data you get from the commission in each state and so forth. We tried, we couldn't find FMLA data that we could analyze. The FMLA disclosures are nominally limited to the reason why the individual's own health condition or family member's health condition is going to justify their taking unpaid leave. And so you're going to have this information disclosed. Congress and the Labor Department in the regs have not addressed at all the privacy issues that you raise prior to GINA, post GINA, and so it is a good point. It's another statute. There probably are 24 other kinds of disclosures that we don't even have on the list. We don't have unemployment insurance. Sometimes you have to disclose if it's a health-based reason why you're off work and that sort of thing. So, I mean, there's many, many kinds of disclosures. And I think if we want to try to protect privacy comprehensively, we need to be thinking creatively about how are we going to limit the disclosures to that which is essential. And, you know, when you're an employer, you have a right to certain information. You need certain information. There are all sorts of issues that are kind of secondary or tertiary issues. So I'll give you another example to show you how complicated this is. Suppose I apply for a job as a security guard in a bank, and I have sequestered my mental health information, and I'm going to be carrying a gun and shooting at people. Now, what information does the bank have a right to? And now, how do you overrule the sequestration because we've determined that it's essential and job related? And as you can see, it very easily gets complicated. But nobody ever said privacy was easy, or nobody ever said privacy was free. There's a high cost to privacy. Privacy in terms of financial costs, the hassle cost, in terms of interference with clinical care, public health, research, all sorts of beneficial uses. And our job, and that is the job of people who believe in privacy, is to try to figure out how you can align those interests so you can protect privacy without throwing the baby out with the bathwater and stopping all public health reporting and stopping all research and that sort of thing.
Super. We have one on two, perhaps more questions, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the floor. So.
Thanks. My name is Tim Considine. I'm a law student here at the U and a recovering pharmaceutical executive.
Well, you picked the wrong way to do it.
Yeah, maybe it is frying pan fire. I'm not sure. This is kind of a more general question addressed to Devin and Nick and maybe some of the other presenters as well. I was really gratified that the question came up about consent, and where my interest lies is in the informed part of the consent rather than the consent part of the consent almost. And if we have this fantastic new matrix where individual healthcare consumers can choose from a battery of drop-down menus to partially disclose X information to Y provider, I think that's only meaningful, and I think that's only helpful, and I think consent is only real if it's informed and fully informed. So as a healthcare consumer for nigh on 40 years now, and a clinical researcher for 15 years, I have yet to fully comprehend any disclosure I've signed or consent that I have given or asked other people to give. So given the potentially apocalyptic landscape that has been described to us by Nick at the very beginning, and what Brad and Devin kind of described yesterday as potential risks and maybe overstatement of potential risks and perhaps understatement of potential risks, what can we tell consumers and patients to make their consent real?
Devin, why don't you come?
I think this is Devon McGraw, Director of the Health Privacy Project at CDT. We've written a fair amount about consent, actually, and while I do consent in the health privacy sphere, we actually have another unit at CDT that works on consumer privacy on the internet, and so we've actually written about it kind of in both contexts. We do think there is an autonomy value to asking patients and consumers about uses of their information. Having said that, it is absolutely the weakest link in privacy. And it just, people don't read them. If they read them, they don't understand them. They're usually written in general terms in order to keep them nice and short, which they rarely are, but if they are, all sorts of uses and disclosures are hidden within broad terms like, or broad sentences like, from time to time, we'll access your health data in order to improve our ability to provide you with health benefits and to improve your health care, and who wouldn't consent to that? But it doesn't say anything, and the same thing with those drop-down menus. I've seen samples of them. Do you consent to having your data used for quality assurance? Oh, okay. But what does that mean? Who defines what quality assurance is and under what terms and conditions? So our own view is that a sort of a set of rules about who can access information and for what purposes is where you start, and we don't even have a great set to begin with. So improving those is much more important than trying to look to consent as the way to protect people's privacy. I actually went to a practitioners conference, this is a little aside, where the lawyer said, if you have any doubt, just get the patients to say it's okay, because they will. And in the healthcare context, it's even worse because you don't really have an ability to say no. Now, research is another issue. I'm talking more about the sort of regular context of treatment and payment and, you know, that sort of back-end office healthcare operation stuff, which is right now a kitchen sink. Now, having pooped all over consent, I still think that in an electronic world, there might be some ways to enhance it if we're careful about when we ask for it, so that we don't have consent overload, so people are just checking boxes randomly, that we build in meaningful opportunities for people to consent where there's an opportunity to talk to somebody, where it's a consent moment versus a piece of paper. It's a participatory consent versus just, you know, you're reading a form, and there are some developing technology tools that are providing some enhancements largely in the consumer technology space, not necessarily with respect to healthcare system consent. So I think that the ideal is, and I'm going to go back to something that Mark just said, which is that always with this stuff, it's very complicated. You want to find a way to provide value to individuals as autonomous persons who have the right to make certain choices, while at the same time recognizing that the consumers also have interest in information flows for certain purposes, and then figure out what's the right set of moments where we must ask for consent, and we must make it a consent that's meaningful, but not look to consent as the sole answer or even the most important thing that we need to resolve. So I'll stop there.
So the plug is the next issue of the Journal of Law, Medicine, and Ethics is a symposium on health information technology and the physician-patient relationship. And I had the privilege of co-editing that with Melissa Goldstein from GW School of Medicine, and Leslie has an excellent article in there, and I also have an article in there, and some other folks too who are experts in the field, former AMA president and various people. So it would be a good thing to buy at your local newsstand.
Sally Milam, I'm the Chief Privacy Officer for West Virginia's executive branch of our state government. I've got a question for Devin. I'm thinking.
There are multiple microphones up here, so.
Oh yeah, you could just sit.
3 or 4 people.
Great idea.
That would work well.
I'm thinking about the idea that you proposed yesterday around smart agreements, smart de-identification that's tailored to the specific situation. And I'm also thinking about state and local public health's mission and what they do. And they have a lot of record level data, completely identifiable, and they have a huge mission to push that data out to people who need it, to help population health researchers, a lot of different reasons why they have to get this data out as quickly as they can. They put some data out on the web with identifiers stripped. They use limited data sets. They do it in a variety of ways, and they have limited resources. So how would your proposal work with state and local public health authority who, when you think on a good day, it takes a while to get data from them as it is. So how would that work with smart agreements and smart de-identification? Yeah,
I'm not going to have I think those are really good questions, Sally. This is Devon McGraw responding. And I don't have a good answer. Where's Brad? Here. Yeah, I think those are questions that have to be addressed, and I may not be even the best person to answer it, because I think it's a policy development area that is sorely needed. My own sense, based on conversations that we had yesterday in the sort of 2 de-identification workshops, is that putting this data online for anyone to access is incredibly risky. And that making the data available for folks who need it for a legitimate purpose and doing that in a much more careful way is a lot more protective, again, because of that notion that the riskiness of data is based on who the person who accesses it, what kind of data they might be able to access to and what their motivation is. You can't control either one of those things when you're just putting data up on a public website. So depending on the sensitivity of the data that's up there, number one, I think that's just not a very wise idea, given that risk is contextual. Having said that, that may be the easiest thing for a cash-strapped public health authority to do, and if they've got a mandate from the legislator to make that possible, it's hard to say how one could really do that beyond sort of trying to track, using maybe some technology to track who's accessed it and trying to provide some minimal oversight, but that would require resources as well. So I'd hate for the publicly available option to be the default, especially based on resource. It just doesn't seem like the right approach. Given that, what's the right next step? I think is a valid question, and one that might be, we put that on the parking lot of research agenda.
I think our last question, because we're within a minute or two of our lunch break.
So this might actually be responding a little bit to that, but yeah. Scott Naris from the Department of Biomedical Informatics here at the University of Utah. So this might respond a little bit to that, but I'd like to get some comments to it too. And this was sparked somewhat by Devon's presentation yesterday. Some of what we're trying to do here is actually develop tools that allow people to get access to some of these data sources that might be public, might be private for research purposes, but allow those original data sources to retain their identification capabilities, but don't open that up to the researchers. But they can use those identified pieces of data to link information to do some higher level sorts of pieces of research. So the tools are public, but the data sources are not necessarily public, so we don't have as large of a worry of disclosure of PHI information, but we allow people to use that information, I guess you could say almost unbeknownst to them, in ways that make research much more valuable, expansive, et cetera. So I think that's an area that we're going in, is again, developing tools that allow this kind of thing while masking the underlying data sources themselves, some of the more sensitive information that people might be able to use.
I mean, again, I think it's worth exploring, although we sort of started this session with a bit of a reaffirmation of how people feel about having their data used for research purposes without their consent. So we just want to throw that back into the mix so that we acknowledge this sort of full spectrum of issues that we would have to deal with in structuring any of this. And the complication in the public health context is that so often the way that the laws are written tie the hands of public health officials, because you can't always count on the legislatures to be able to surface these questions at the level of detail that you would want. So that's a complication.
Brad, you have.
I can run to the front.
By the time I get around there, you can run. And then Brad gets the last word.
I ran to the front. Two things. So to relate to Scott's comment as well as the earlier comment. I'm Brad Malin. I'm a professor at Vanderbilt University's Department of Biomedical Informatics. And I'm a recovering public policy advocate. Okay. Just kidding. So first thing is that the way in which you guys are pursuing things is very similar to the way in which lots of medical centers in the United States is pursuing things, which is that we've got this extremely sensitive underlying repository. Let's build some middleware on top of this and obscure information, obscure identifiers from the users of that information. Try to have a multi-tiered process in terms of, we give you information that is not very specific initially, and if you can't reject your hypothesis, then you may want to come back to us for more specific information, at which point we may vet you at a more detailed level. What we've learned at Vanderbilt, at least, is that there are only a certain number of times in which you can actually do that to somebody. There's only a certain number of levels that you can actually execute. We actually ended up at a situation of 2, which is that we do record counting. Record counting gives you aggregate statistics on the population. And if you deem that that data is still necessary or still interesting for you to work with, and you want to have more specific information, actual natural language associated with what happened with that visit, then you can come back and get, much more oversight approved information. But this other issue of the extent to which individuals have agreed to be within these types of research studies, I think it's a very strange situation because the United States is kind of fragmented with respect to the way in which it manages information. So healthcare is kind of put on this little pedestal in terms of having privacy regs, whereas other information is completely out there. And like the best examples that I give of this are things like property assessment records, tax information, which is totally online. And I can get this on just about anybody in the entire country. And other things such as soon as you die, we publish your social security number, right? And we do this because we don't want there to be fraud committed against individuals who have died, right? And so it's a really interesting problem because in the UK and in the EU, they have privacy commissioners. They have overarching privacy commissioners that really give some type of a designation of what's acceptable with respect to data, right? Health data doesn't have that much of a distinction in their perspective. So I'd say in one respect, we've got we can protect health information more, but we also have a problem in our regulatory schema in terms of making this special distinction for people who work in the healthcare domain. So. Wow, I'm on tape, aren't I?
I'd certainly,
you didn't hear me say that.
I certainly endorse looking at the non-US systems. The Australian health privacy guidelines, the Australian Health Privacy Commissioner and Privacy Commissioner and the health privacy guidelines that fell out of that are really interesting. They are understandable and principled, and they tie things together well. Please check your Facebook preferences.
I will make one, if I can make one brief comment, one very brief comment. It comes back to this notion of why we actually put this information online in the first place and why we give public health people access to this, which is that they're trying to move as efficiently and swiftly as possible if there's actually an epidemiologic problem or any type of an outbreak. But there are alternatives to this, right? You do have to ask this question of why are we actually revealing identifiers on everybody all the time to these people, as opposed to saying, you tell me what the model is that you actually want to apply on this data. We can actually run that with respect to the data. If you find something that actually hits the model, then we can reveal that information and you can go off and do something. And the reason why we don't do that is because, well, I don't think that people have actually tried to sit down and develop what those models explicitly are. They're a little too variable in nature. But if we actually spent some time and said, here's the canonical set of problems that we're trying to solve on a daily basis, maybe we could have that type of disclosure control. That's it.
Thank you. I want to say thank you to Mark in particular. Oops, I'm sorry. Let's say thank you to Mark in particular and all the panelists and all the discussants. It's been a really interesting session.